started, folks. It's 7 o'clock on the button. I want to thank you all for coming out on this beautiful evening for our finance town hall. This is our second one for the year, and we've had a series of discussions all throughout the year through our board work sessions, etc. But we're at a point in the year that a lot has developed, and we wanted to give you all an opportunity to learn a little bit more about our school budgeting process, kind of what we are seeing on the horizon, and answer any questions that you might have. My name is Michael Thomas. I am your superintendent, and really proud to serve this amazing community. And I'm going to turn it over to our Director of Finance and Business Services, Tammy Frederickson, and her wonderful team who have put together this presentation tonight. And stick around, and we won't be here till 9 o'clock. We just kind of build that timeline in just in case, but I'm sure we'll get out and you'll still have some daylight to enjoy. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tammy.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Be sure you grab a cookie either before, after, during, whatever. Eat cookies. Want to start out tonight just kind of giving you a real quick kind of refresher. If you've seen any of these presentations, you are familiar with where we get money, but I just want to make sure that we review that real quick. About 80% of our revenue comes from the state of Minnesota, and most of that is from the general fund formula, which in 24-25 will be $2,781 per student, and that is set in statute. The legislature determines what that amount is. They did, in this round of legislation, put an automatic inflation factor in that, but they capped it at 3%. We also get categorical aid from the state. And those dollars come in for a specific purpose, so you have to use them for the intended purpose. So it's things like special education or our school meal program. There's maintenance, but you can't move the monies around for other things other than what it was intended for. We get partial reimbursement for special education. Special ed is not fully funded, but we do get partial reimbursement from the state. Then about 17% of our revenue comes from local property taxes and voter-approved referendum. And then there's a small percentage that comes from the federal government. The federal dollars usually flow from the federal government to the state, to the school districts. And those are things like the Every Student Succeeds Act, which some people recognize it as Title I, and Individuals with Disabilities Act, which is the special education federal dollars. Many of the funding formulas that school districts have are based on enrollment. So the formulas are, again, set in statute. They're based on how many students you have in the district. We've had a slight decline over the past few years, and part of that is there's just declining birth rates in the state. The state demographer also has noted that Minnesota is an aging population. They found that the number of Minnesotans who are turning 65 in this decade actually will be greater than all of them in the past 4 decades combined. So we're just an aging population in this state. Prior Lake Savage Area School community actually has a very high proportion of residents who don't have children in their home. If you have an increase in enrollment, obviously you get additional revenue, and a decrease in enrollment will obviously get you less money than you had in the past. The funding formula has not kept pace with inflation. So if we look at the amount of money that we get per pupil, that's the yellow line. And next year, like I said, it will be $7,281 per student. We were to receive money based on the inflation, we would have $8,637 per student, which would generate another $9 million just in our district alone. When we look at how we spend our money, we have about 83 cents on the dollar that's used directly for teaching and learning of students. So that includes salaries and benefits, supplies like curriculum, materials in the classroom. And then there's about 12 cents on the dollar that's spent on purchase services like transportation or utilities or some of the other service contracts that we have. And then an additional 5 cents on the dollar is spent on capital expenditures, for instance, equipment and maintenance and some of our leases. In the 2023 legislature, they allocated a lot of additional resources to schools, and we greatly appreciate that. However, a lot of them came with some very specific mandates. Some of these mandates that have dollars that we're required to spend money on are things like summer employment insurance, the earned safe and sick time, paid family medical leave. We have some increased rates. There's cannabis and substance abuse education programs, some additional grad requirements like the READ Act, and some additional professional development training that we're required to do. So for this current school year, or for 24-25, the budget that we're building, we're going to get approximately $7.8 million in new money that we hadn't had before. But $4 million of it is going to be earmarked for some of those state mandates that we're required to do. And then another $3 million of that $7.8 million is going to be used to offset some of the inflationary cost increases in our budgets. If we look at the funding formula versus how much do we spend on per student. So again, the funding formula is $7,281 per pupil for 24-25. It's now tied to inflation with a 3% cap. But if we look at how much we spend on educating a student, it's about $13,243 per year, compared to a state average of $15,731. So while that kind of seems like it's efficient or cost effective, we have to keep in mind that by having lower per pupil than the state average, we're not able to do some new or innovative programs for our students. So we can't do things like increase electives at the high school, or we can't expand our mid-caps program to meet some of the needs that we would like to grow our programs. I know this is hard to see, but this breaks down the different categories that the state tracks for spending. This information is available on the Minnesota Department of Education website. You can look up any school district, and then they also have a file for the state averages. So how do we spend our dollars? This is a 5-year history. The 2021, 21-22, 22-23, those are actual numbers from our audit. The 23-24 is what we anticipate our budget to look like at the end of the year. And the 24-25 is our projections for next year. So you can see that while we're getting additional revenue every year, and you can see the increase from 115 million to 120 million, that's a direct reflection on the legislative increases that we have, but our expenses are increasing at a higher rate. But given that, we're still spending, if you look in the categories, about the same percentages for the last 5 years that we have been spending. And this is a percent of the total budget. So for instance, the special ed services, that line, if you'll notice, has stayed pretty steady at 17%. This year went up to 18.2, and then next year will be about 20.5. And that's a direct reflection on a very large increase in the number of special education students that we're anticipating receiving next year. And they're also coming to us with greater needs than we've seen in the past. We've also, if you'll notice, we've been taking fund balance dollars to balance the budget every year, with the exception of 21-22. which was a COVID year, and we had a lot of schools closed. We had staff that, we had vacant positions that we weren't able to fill with staff. So we had significant savings on that year. We didn't have to use fund balance to balance the budget. But every other year we have been balancing our budget, which means by the Department of Education's terms, we do not have a structurally balanced budget. We look at, this is kind of just a trend line. Again, our total expenditures are exceeding our revenue. We anticipate that happening again over the next several years. And we have to anticipate what are we going to do to combat that. So one of the things we did for next year was reduce some of our expenditures. And this is a list of some of the proposals that we've given to the school board on some proposed reductions. So we were reducing the number of classrooms due to the decline in enrollment. We have fewer students, so we need fewer teachers, so we're adjusting the number of classrooms to meet the enrollment. We have some targeted staff reductions, some software programs we're not going to renew. We're going to move some overhead costs to our community ed and food services funds. Reduce some support for initiatives and projects and some professional development cuts. And given all that, we've identified about $3.2 million of reductions. In order to balance our budget, we need just under $5 million worth of reductions. So we still have just under $1 million that we were unable to identify without making some serious impact on the students at our buildings. So we had a conversation with the school board on Monday night, and they agreed to let us explore using about $1 million from fund balance in order to balance our budget for 24-25. We will come up with a list of things that we will use the money for, and we will make sure that those are one-time expenses, because once you spend the money out of your fund balance, it's gone. You won't see it again. So we want to make sure that we're not having continuing costs coming out of our fund balance. Some possible revenue increases, we could, with declining birth rates, we're really unlikely to see an increase in enrollment. We could increase some activity fees, which would generate a small amount of revenue. That means increasing some of the costs to take driver's ed or some of the co-curriculars or athletic fees. It just doesn't generate a lot of money. So the other option is we could possibly ask for a voter-approved operating levy. You can see on this chart that we're on the low end of comparable other districts who have a operating referendum. Ours is about $623 per student. You've got the high ones on this end that are over $2,000 per student. So they're receiving about 3 times more money from the voter-approved operating levy than what we receive. So what is a voter-approved operating levy? The operating levies are used for the day-to-day dollars to cover the operational expenses. Whatever you can use your formula allowance dollars for, you are allowed to use your operating levy dollars. So things like salaries for teachers and staff, classroom supplies, utilities, transportation costs, all the other operational expenses, you can use your operating levy. And the operating levy started in 1971 with legislation that had really pretty limited requirements on how you would spend the dollars. And it consisted of 3 equalized tiers. And the intent of the money was to try to get every district in the state where they would be able to ask their voters for additional dollars. But because the formula is based on a market value of the property, it is inconsistent across the state. So they tried to do some things through the years to try and make it a little more consistent in how school districts could ask for an operating levy. And one of the things they did in 2019 was to take the Tier 1, which was $300 per student, and move it to a local optional revenue, and then reduce 3 tiers to 2 tiers, and change the equity market adjustment. So the result of that is that when we approved the levy in 2017, we had asked our taxpayers for $923 per student, and then with this legislative change, 300 of that moved to the local optional revenue, which makes it revenue neutral, but it also means that the $300 is part of your automatic levy. It's separate from the voter approved. But now when you ask for voter approved levy, there's an in-state statute cap that you can ask for, which is $2,079 per pupil. Plus you can ask for an inflationary factor. Then they subtract the $300 that was moved to the local option. So I know that gets really confusing, but the bottom line is that our current voter approved referendum is $623.97. And this is the spreadsheet that comes right from the Minnesota Department of Education to show that we get $623.97 every year until the 27-28 school year when it expires. And you also see that bottom line, the total authority without CPI. We did not ask for an inflation factor in our levy when we approved it. We could have, but we consistently get the $623.97 with no levy or no inflation factor built in. So if we look at the school districts around the metro area, we're highlighted in yellow. We have $623.97. The local optional revenue is the $300 that they moved, and then there's $424 that's in statute that every school district can ask voters for. It's just kind of an automatic part of the local optional. And then there are many districts that have either a capital, a tech levy, a safety and security levy, and that gets added in there because those are also voter approved. So you can see that we're third from the bottom, and most of the other districts have like 3 times more dollars than what we're currently receiving. We did a Morris Leatherman survey recently to get an idea of how our taxpayers feel about how the school district's doing, and rather kind of a tax tolerance to see if the levy is something that we want to pursue. And the results of that survey, we found that 90% think the district is meeting the learning needs of all or most of the students. 90% feel that there is a safe and secure environment. 81% say they're proud to be a part of the district. 80% think that we do a good job of communicating. And then 76% agree that we manage resources effectively. The survey was 500 random samples of households in our community. Some of the demographics were that 15% have preschool students, 30% have school-age students, and 66% of our community actually are, they call empty nesters, which means they have no students in their household. And if we look at kind of how they are spread out, 58% of them actually live in Prior Lake, 32% in Savage, and then 10% are in our townships. We also have the average home value for our district, including all of the community. It's about $430,000 is the average household value. When we asked what things that they would like or would like to see a property tax increase used for if we did go that route, and you could see that the top 5 are pretty high percentages, over 70%. improve safety and security. So even though 90% of the people that were polled felt they had a safe and secure environment, 77% still felt that we could improve safety and security. 71% thought we should expand career pathways. 70% reduce class sizes and maintain class sizes. And 69% thought enhanced behavior intervention was needed in the district. So if we looked at the survey results, when they asked the final, all of the questions, asked what their values were, went through the whole 10 pages of the survey. This is kind of the end result, that we had 12% of our community strongly supported operating levy, 45% supported it, 32% are opposed, 8% strongly opposed, and 3% are unsure. So if we were to ask our voters for an operating referendum levy, what would that mean? Remember I said we have currently $623 per student. In the scenario A, if we increase the amount from $623 to $1,404, on a $450,000 home, that would be an additional about $30 a month. Or as we've been saying, about 2 pizzas a month. If we increased it to $45, we would get a per pupil amount of $1,803. And then if we had the max, which is about an increase of almost $61, the new amount would be, with inflation, $2,248. So under scenario A, it would generate about $7.1 million. Scenario B would be about $10.8 million, and then scenario C would be $14.7 million. And keeping in mind that we cut $5 million out of our budget this year, if we were to ask for the $30, got $7.1 million, we're kind of pushing the can down the road. So we made $5 million worth of cuts. We're going to have increases in our expenses moving forward. There's going to be salary increases, benefit increases, there's inflationary costs on some of our contracts and services. So while we may be able to have the 25-26 school year not using fund balance, 26-27 will be back where we are right now and looking at some cuts. We were hoping that if we in fact do ask for a voter-approved referendum, that we would be able to do some innovative things. We want to make changes and add programs for our students, and the $7.1 million would not be able to do that. And even if when you just looked at the list of what the priorities were from our community, we wouldn't be able to do all of those things. And none of these are going to get us so that we can do everything on that list. But we would like to be able to do 2, 3, or 4 things, which means we really need to ask for some additional dollars. There's also, you'll see in scenario A and B, there's another column that has $16. We have 2 bonds. When you sell bonds, you have the principal and interest on bond payments, and it's part of your debt service levy. So again, the taxpayers are picking up that burden. It just is a debt service. It can only be used to pay off those bonds. We have 2 bonds that will be paid off in fiscal year 29. And once they fall off, or we could pay them off, then it reduces the debt service levy, which means that the taxpayers will see some relief on their property tax statement by about $16. So one of the things we were looking at is in 29 through 35, could we in fact either ask for another referendum or use the $16 to add to the ask that we're going to have for this current one, knowing that in fiscal year 29, those 2 bonds will fall off. So again, nothing's been decided. We're going to have that conversation with the school board at the next school board meeting. And there's another study session. So there'll be a lot of conversation around what it would look like if we were to pursue that route. So yeah, what does that mean for a district? Our current pupil amount is $624. If we increased it by $780, we would see additional $7.1 million per year. If we went up to 1803, that would be $10.8 million. And if we went to the cap, it would be about $14.8 million a year. $14.8 million a year would allow us to do some of those very innovative and expanded programs that we would love to do. So what is next? The May 6th board meeting will be presenting a preliminary 24-25 budget to the school board. May 13th, there's a study session. We'll be giving them some further analytics around whether we go for a voter-approved referendum. June 10th, the board has to vote on the budget. We have to have an approved budget by June 30th, or we don't get any money if anybody's following Anoka Hennepin. The board determines if we're going to go forward with the board-approved referendum. And then in July and August, if in fact they decide that, we will start communicating to our community what that looks like for the vote. And then November 5th is election day. So I went through that pretty quick, so we certainly answer any questions.